Okay, hi everyone. We're going to kick this day off with a bang. I'm Carol Mioseth. I'm Institutional Giving Manager at the American Writers Museum, and I'd like to welcome you all to our partner stage, where we present programs curated by our valued community partners. Chicago's rich literary landscape is why it was chosen for the nation's only museum dedicated to America's writers and their work. We're thrilled to showcase these organizations and thank them for being a part of today's celebration of the past, present, and future of American writing. Our first program today is presented by the Newberry Library. Scholars Rose Miron and Jean O'Brien discuss the power and importance of Indigenous storytelling, activism, history, and memory, as well as Miron's book, Indigenous Archival Activism, Mohican Interventions in Public History and Memory. Rose is the director of the Darcy McNichol Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library in Chicago and affiliate faculty in the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research at Northwestern University. Jean O'Brien of the White Earth Ojibwe Nation is Regents Professor and McKnight Distinguished University Professor of History at University of Minnesota. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you all so much for being here this morning. We're going to jump right into the questions because we have 40 minutes, and then there's going to be a book signing on the 9th floor. So, Rose, I'd like to start by asking you to talk about how you came to write this book.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for coming today. This is a little bit of a long story, but I'll try to keep it relatively short. This book project actually started when I was an undergraduate. I was a history major at the University of Minnesota, and I had the opportunity to participate in a program at that institution called the Undergraduate Research Opportunity Program, which gives undergrads the opportunity to work with a faculty member on primary source research. And at the time that I had heard about this program, I was taking an American Indian Studies course, and I always tell people that taking that Native history course really changed the way that I understood the world. It really flipped my understanding of American history on its head, and I always say I have always wanted other people to have that same reckoning. And so I had the opportunity to take part in this program. I was interested in doing something related to Native history because of this class that I was taking. And so I cold emailed a handful of professors asking them if they would work with me and be my mentor on a project. And very fortunately for me, the first person to reply was Jean O'Brien. And so she said, why don't you think about what you might want to write about and come back and pitch me 3 projects, and we'll choose one together that sounds like it would be a good fit. And so one of the things that I came across in my Googling and a bit of research that I did as I looked for something to write about was this oral history program that was happening in a tribal community that was about an hour away from where I grew up, in the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation. And this was a video oral history project with the title, Here Are Stories, We Are Still Here. And I was struck in the moment that I came across this project with both, I mean, first of all, just my own ignorance. This community was an hour from where I grew up, and I had very little knowledge about them at all. And so I was really struck by that, first of all. But then I was also struck by this series with such a provocative title that so strongly pushed back against the very erasure that I was, seeing, right? That I had never really learned about this community with such a title like We Are Still Here. And so I was really interested in how the community was pushing back against that narrative, and particularly because they are the Mohicans and they have been so thoroughly attempted to be erased by James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans. I think, I was really struck by just the way that they were really clearly pushing back against that narrative. And so I went to a public viewing of one of the video interviews in the community, and I started talking to people who were working at the Library Museum at that point. And I came back and I watched the rest of the oral interviews, and I was really captivated by this series. And they said, there's a whole archive that you might be really interested in looking at. We have an archive here, we have a museum, and so I started driving to the reservation on my winter breaks and my spring breaks, and just started talking to people, and eventually I was invited to attend a meeting of the Stockbridge-Munsee Historical Committee, which is a group of women who have been working to reclaim and retell the tribe's history since the late 1960s. And so as I kind of got further into this, I ultimately wrote my undergraduate thesis on this oral history project, but I very quickly realized that that was really just one piece of this much larger reclamation story, and this larger effort to reclaim and to recover and to really rewrite Mohican history in a way that it was told by members of its own community. And so that was really fascinating to me. And then through conversations with the historical committee, it became clear that they were also really interested in having that story be told. And so we worked together to think about what that would look like, first as a dissertation in graduate school, and then ultimately as a book.
That's really helpful. That's great. That piece of collaboration is really difficult. It takes a long time to build. So it was fortuitous that you were able to do that over so many years, right? So for those who are unfamiliar with Mohican history, can you give us a quick abstract of the longer history in addition to what you've already told us, and what brought them to Wisconsin in the 19th century?
Yeah. So the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation is a combination of both Mohican people and Munsee people, both of whom originate and whose homelands are on the east coast of what is now the United States. Mohican homelands are in the Mohicanatuck, or the Hudson River Valley, kind of on both sides of the river in what are now the states of New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and then Munsee homelands are just a little bit further south than that in kind of western Connecticut. And these communities have always been related to each other. They are distinct, but they've always been relatives, and you know, they both experienced removal and the encroachment of white settlers in very similar ways, which is ultimately why they were removed together and became one nation eventually. So the Stockbridge part of the name comes from a village in western Massachusetts that was actually originally and has always been a Mohican village called Winnetocook. And in 1734, Mohican leadership decided to accept a Christian mission that would be based in Stockbridge. They really viewed this as a way to make sure that their children were learning how to speak English, and they really saw it as a way to make sure that they were able to move forward in a world that was being increasingly filled with white settlers. So they decided to accept this mission. The missionary that came in, John Sargent, renamed the town Stockbridge, and so that's where the first part of that, the now tribal name, the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans, comes from, because there were actually multiple tribal communities that came to Stockbridge and lived there, and then ultimately they were removed together. Folks lived in Stockbridge. I would say that was sort of like the center of the Mohican Nation at that time, though there were certainly other villages in the area. And then in the 1780s, after increasing encroachment onto their lands in Stockbridge and increasing efforts to push them out of the village, they accepted an invitation to move to upstate New York with the Oneida Nation. And then eventually in the early 1820s, all of those folks were removed to what is now the state of Wisconsin. There were several more removals within Wisconsin that I'm just going to gloss over for the purpose of time today. But I will just say that the collective Stockbridge-Munsee Mohicans were removed 7 different times from their original homelands in the Mohicanatuck River Valley to what is now the reservation in central Wisconsin, very near Wausau, if folks know where that is. The other part of Mohican history that I would just love to cover really briefly, because I think it's really important to this story, in addition to removal, is the fact that this is a community that has always recorded and passed along their history through different generations. There are recorded oral stories now about this tradition of what one author, Lisa Brooks, has called recorders and rememberers, and it's this tradition of having somebody within the tribe who passes along history from time to time. Hendrik Oppenpot, who was a Mohican leader in the 18th century, eventually put that history into writing, and his was really the first written account of the history. But then next generations of Mohican people also continued to carry on that tradition of recording and remembering. And I would say, you know, this book and the people that it's about, the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Historical Committee, are really the contemporary recorders and rememberers. And the book talks about how they have really reimagined that role of recording and remembering history. You know, it's a much more collaborative effort now than being a single person. And it's pretty much entirely done by women now, which, you know, we can't say for sure that it wasn't done before by women, but it's always been recorded as a male role. And it's also sort of this twin effort of not only recovering and passing along history to future generations of Stockbridge-Munsee people, but also really changing the way that Mohican history is told more broadly.
Such an amazing story of resilience and survival and creativity, just female leadership.
Yeah.
So picking up on the first half of your title of the book, can you tell us how you came to conceptualize this book through the lens of Indigenous archival activism? And what do you mean by the term, and how did you have that help you organize your thoughts on history?
Yeah,
history?
Sure. So as Jeannie probably remembers, I did this project on this oral history part of the historical committee's work, but then I really thought that I was going to write a book about tribal museums. That was something that a lot of people in the field of Native studies were talking about, and the Saquatrense community has a very robust tribal museum, and so I really thought that that's what I would be writing about. But as I got further into the archives and as I continued to talk with historical committee members, I realized that all of these different things that were happening within this larger historical recovery project, that the museum was only one part of it, this oral history project was only one part of it. The book covers other elements such as coordinated trips back to Mohican homelands, all of these different interventions in public history spaces like museums, but also things like walking tours and signage. And I was trying to figure out, what do all of these things have in common? What is going on with all of these different activities aside from the fact that they are all attempting to recover and rewrite Mohican history from a more Mohican perspective. And I realized that they were all connected back to the tribal archive, and that they all really stemmed from this moment in 1968 when community members came together to really create the tribal archive. There were community members that had been collecting materials since about the 1930s, but there was a fire in the home of the community member who had all of these materials in 1968, and neighbors actually rushed in and saved all of these documents because they were so important to people. And it was that moment that really, it was sort of the literal spark that led to the creation of the historical committee. And from there, it was the archive from which all of these activities grew out of. The historical committee was going through papers as they planned these historical trips home. They were going through all of these archival records as they were trying to rewrite these museum exhibitions. And so I realized that this was sort of a constellation of activities, but that the archive was the thing that united them all. And so I think it was actually in conversation with the two of us that we kind of came up with this term of Indigenous Archival Activism as a way to categorize all of those activities. And then, I will say the term evolved a little bit after I finished graduate school and I was in the process of revising the dissertation into the book, because I had the opportunity first to work for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, which is a nonprofit based in Minneapolis. And my main role in that organization was to plan for the creation of a digital archive of boarding school materials. And so I was working firsthand in the effort of trying to locate, trying to access, and trying to figure out how to get all of these records related to boarding schools in a place where they were more controlled and more accessible to tribal communities. And then also the role that I have now in the Newberry Library as the director of the Darcy McNichol Center. A huge part of my role is connecting with tribal communities and making sure that they have access to the materials in the collection that are relevant to their histories. And I think in both of those roles, I've just had the opportunity to talk more and more about some of the barriers that Native people and Native community members face as they're trying to access archival materials. And I realized that I had been describing sort of the efforts that institutions like the Newberry should be doing to make these records more accessible as really relating to access, trying to make these records more accessible, but also sovereignty, really making sure that tribes have the ability to control how these records are being made accessible, who's using them, and how so. And I had been describing those two things as the sort of levers that institutions could pull in order to have Native people have the ability to create new narratives about their history. And so ultimately, when I was revising the book, I decided to think about that term a little further as being categorized by sort of three pillars: access, sovereignty, and new narratives. And I use that as a framing device throughout the book to think about the efforts that the Historical Committee did in their efforts to make these records more accessible, and to make history more accessible to their own community members, as well as to take more control over the materials that they were recovering and representations of their history, and then all of the different types of new narratives that they were creating. And then the conclusion of the book really ends with a call to what I call settler colonial institutions to also think about those three pillars and think about how they can increase access, respect tribal sovereignty, and thinking about new narratives that are more controlled by tribal nations as a goal. So.
That's wonderful. So my next question builds directly on that. So this book is rooted deeply in community collaboration through your carefully curated relationships with Mohican people, especially women. Can you talk about the centrality of relationality in your work and perhaps in Indigenous studies more broadly?
Sure, absolutely. So as I mentioned, I think this project really started with my being in the community and having conversations with people and being directed to this larger archive by community members. And, you know, together, as I was starting to work on this project, we talked about what an equitable process would look like for this research project. You know, from my undergraduate thesis to my dissertation to an article that I ultimately published and then ultimately the book, each one of those things has been reviewed by historical committee members and people have been paid for that labor. Every single one of them has been approved by the tribal council before being submitted. And so it was really important to me that this product was being reviewed by the people who it was about so that it was accurate. And I also really wanted to make sure that the project was something that benefited them and it was something that was not just interesting to me, but something that was actually a priority for the tribe. So when I think about relationality, I mean, so much of, and to get to your question about Indigenous studies, so much of the disciplines of both history and anthropology and other disciplines related to working with Native people have really been defined by extraction, in which researchers are going into communities, taking information, sometimes without permission, and then publishing it, and they are the ones benefiting from that. The communities from which they're extracting this knowledge are not benefiting from that. And that is really the opposite of what I wanted to do with this project. And so I really wanted to foreground relationality and thinking about how this would be a project that could benefit the community, as it was also, of course, benefiting me as a scholar. And so together, the community and I sort of established this iterative process where I was consistently attending historical committee meetings. As I would go to different archives, I was checking in with them about like what things I could scan, what kind of materials I could bring back. I was consistently at historical committee meetings presenting information and sharing updates. And then ultimately we created different processes as well for things like the oral histories in the book. I ultimately conducted a couple of oral history interviews, and we went through an entire process with the legal department to make sure that the copyright for those oral histories would always remain with the tribe, and that the materials would be deposited into the tribal archive rather than being owned by me. So there was multiple just sort of checkpoints, I guess you could say, throughout the process to just really make sure that the book was being reviewed and was really attending to the priorities of the community. And then ultimately, all of the proceeds from the book also go to the tribe. So that was really important to me too, that you don't make a lot of money on academic books, but the money is not coming to me. This is something that is a project for the community. And I think we're seeing this increasingly in Indigenous studies, which I'm really happy about. And I think it really is about attending to these really negative past experiences and instead just really making sure that communities have a say and have control and have the ability to shape materials that are being published about their histories.
Directly on that theme, can you tell us where people can access public materials created by the tribe, since this is all about centering tribal and community prerogatives?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation's website is a really lovely place to start. The Department of Cultural Affairs, which is now the official folks who are doing a lot of the work that the historical committee started to do, has a really nice website that has a lot of really great information. They have a PDF of one source that I would really recommend that I really relied heavily on in the book. It's called A Brief History of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation by Dorothy Davids. Dorothy Davids was one of the co-founders of the historical committee, and that pamphlet has been updated over time. And so the PDF of that is available online, and I think I always recommend that is a great place to start if you just want to learn more about Stockbridge-Munsee history. That page also has a number of other resource guides, like a fact sheet and like an FAQ sheet for people who are interested in learning more. There's also several videos of tribal members talking about their own histories, and one that I would especially like to recommend is there is a link to this really wonderful walking tour of Stockbridge, Massachusetts that the community created just a few years ago called Footprints of Our Ancestors, and it is a series of videos of tribal members talking about their ancestors who were assigned plots of land in Stockbridge, and it's the direct descendants of these people who were assigned land standing in the land that their ancestor was assigned, talking about what it means to them to return to that place. Of course, if you happen to be in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, it's a better experience to do the tour as a walking tour, but you can access the entire thing online. And so I always encourage people to look at that if they're interested in learning a little bit more about the history of Stockbridge and about the community. The other thing I just want to put in a quick blurb for is that the Mohican community has a Mohican Writers Circle where they continue to cultivate the creation of new narratives from everywhere from youth to elders. And they have published a few journals, but they just published another one called Along the Many Trails, a journal of contemporary literature by the Mohican people. And you can buy that, most places their books are sold, including Amazon. So if you're interested in reading more work by Mohican people, I think that's a great place to start.
So all of this just really demonstrates the long history and the continued vibrancy of this community around its own history and heritage and culture. It's amazing. So what surprised you the most about your research?
Well, I'm so glad you asked this question. And I had to think about it a little bit when you sent me the questions ahead of time. And I have to say, for a book that is about archives, I think the biggest thing that surprised me is how much information sits outside of the archive. Both in, the process of writing this book. This book would have been wholly incomplete if I had only looked at archival materials and just written like what I was seeing on the page. And it also, I think, in looking at the archival materials that Mohican community members had gathered, there are many, many examples where when this community project started, copy machines were not widely available. And so a lot of the earliest documents in the archive are actual handwritten transcriptions of documents from like the 17th century that community members were going to places like the National Archives and transcribing and then bringing copies back to the reservation. But the thing is, most of those transcriptions are not just transcriptions. They are the full transcript of whatever the original material is, but then there are marginalia and notes about those histories that people have sort of weighed in on, or there are what scholar Kelly Wisecup calls compilations, where they are sort of a combination of stories written from these archives, but then people are adding in their own experience. So one of the examples that I point to in the book is this document called On Christianity that was written by Arvid E. Miller, who was one of the first people to start collecting this history. And this is really just a combination of quotes from different archival materials from mostly the 17th century about the early Christianization of Mohican people, but then he is also going in and adding his own experiences at the Red Springs Mission School, and he's sort of writing back to some of these histories saying like, yes, Christianity has been an important part of our history, but there are lots of people that also still practice religion in our own ways. And it's not that we were entirely Christianized and colonized and that people did not maintain their own sense of culture. And so there are many, many documents like that in the archive, which I think to me spoke right away to the fact that if you were a researcher who only ever accessed these original documents from the 17th and 18th century, you were going to miss the full story by not coming to the tribal archive and seeing the way that community members have been interacting with these documents. But then I also saw it in even more contemporary documents. There was this moment, actually kind of late in the book's development, where I had written a section on language revitalization, and one of the women who I had been working with for almost 10 years came to me and said, like, I feel like you've really gotten this wrong. And I was like, okay, tell me more, like what is going on? And she's like, well, I was really involved in this, and I just, like, I don't think that you have quite gotten the story right. And it was because a lot of her involvement in this process had not been recorded in the archives in the same way that some of these other people's involvement had. And so we sat down together and I took notes as she talked, and then I rewrote that section and I sent it to her and I said, is this more accurate? And we ultimately came to a version that she felt like more accurately represented this. But again, I would have never known that had I not talked to her. So I think that as a historian who is very much trained to rely on archival materials and a book that is about archives, I think the biggest thing that shocked me was that just looking at archival materials is pretty much never enough. I think it's always really important to talk to the people who these stories matter to, and to think about what knowledge lives outside of archives, especially in Indigenous communities.
A vitally important insight for Indigenous studies. I have to say what surprised me the most were two things when you were doing this work. One is the tours out back east, which, I mean, for me, that's an engagement with modernity and the cultivation of ties, longstanding ties to original homelands, but also the archaeology officer. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. So in 2015, the tribe actually decided to base its tribal historic preservation officer out in Massachusetts, out on the East Coast. This person is somebody who mostly deals with things related to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is a law that requires any institutions that receive federal funding to inventory collections that they have about Native people and to repatriate those materials to relevant tribal communities. There are lots of issues with the law that we don't have time to get into today, but just to say that, you know, a big part of her responsibility is going through those cases, and also working on Section 106, which is a part of the National Historic Preservation Act that requires any kind of like development projects that are breaking ground on new land to consult with tribal communities whose land that they're on, to make sure that they are not disturbing things like burials or sacred sites. And a lot of that work is, you know, you have to sort of be on the ground to do that. You know, the people who are in those roles can get dozens of requests a month for different kinds of consultation and review. And so the person who was in that role before her was like constantly flying back and forth between Wisconsin and the East Coast to work on these projects. And so eventually the tribe just said, you know, these homelands are extremely important to us, and we just need to base our historic preservation office there. And so her role is, you know, hugely involved in both of those laws, but they're also doing new archaeological projects that they are interested in. So right now, for instance, there is a search going on for the site of what was probably an ox roast that was hosted by George Washington after the American Revolution, because Stockbridge-Munsee Mohicans were some of the only people that sided with the Americans in the American Revolution, and George Washington was so pleased with their contributions that after the war he held an ox roast in Stockbridge to celebrate their contributions. And so they're looking for that site, and I think they think that they have found it, but they are doing archaeology that is directed by them to look for these things, as well as doing things like searching for the Stockbridge Meeting House, and so it's been really exciting to see that work happening.
So that prompts me to ask a follow-up that I didn't warn you about.
That's okay, go for it.
So you wrote a wonderful article that I think is called Reclaiming the Tribal Bible.
Yes.
Which is, I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful piece, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and how it demonstrates not just this active engagement with repatriation as a tribal concern, but also Mohican historic engagement with Christianity.
Sure. So just a kind of snapshot of what this is. When the Mohicans were in Stockbridge in the 1730s, they were gifted a 2-volume Bible set from the Prince of Wales, or it was technically the chaplain to the Prince of Wales. And they're these, you know, huge Bible sets. They're like this big. And they were gifted them because this was a Christian mission in which the goal was to Christianize these people. And as they were removed, the Mohicans carried these Bibles with them in this massive chest, and they brought them back. I mean, they ended up on the reservation in Wisconsin by the time they were removed to that area. And then in the early 20th century, a non-native minister who was working with the tribe actually entered the home of a tribal community member and stole these items and then sold them to a museum on the East Coast. And so beginning in the 1970s, the tribe began to try to get these materials back. They requested, you know, they first just requested them from the museum that held them in Stockbridge, and then ultimately coordinated a massive letter writing campaign that actually was fueled by something that they put together called Documents Related to the Stockbridge Bibles, that was copies of all of these archival materials that they had been collecting to show that they were the true owners of these materials. But what I think Jeannie is getting at is that a 2-volume Bible set is not necessarily what you would think about as a sacred Native American object. And certainly that was some of the earliest questions that I got when I started working on that particular part of the project. People were like, these are not, you know, sacred items. But I think what I learned from talking to people and what became very obvious is that the importance of these items, I mean, first of all, there are some Stockbridge-Munsee Mohicans who are still Christian, and so that they are important to them as Christian objects. But for people who that religious aspect was less important, they were important because they connected the community to that place in that time. And they were important as historical objects. It didn't matter that they were Bibles, it mattered because they were given to the community in this moment where the community had made a decision to accept this mission, and that they continued to be important to their ancestors as they carried them across the country as they were removed. And so, you know, to make a very long story short, it took them about 30 years, but they eventually did get these materials back, and they are now in the Tribal Museum today.
Again, the incredible resiliency of these people and their just dynamism, really, really remarkable. Okay, so since we are here at the American Writers Festival, it struck me that it would be important to ask you how you approach the craft of writing.
Yeah, thank you. I want to answer this in two ways. I think the first is that I approach writing as being purpose-driven, in the sense that, you know, with this project and also with any future project that I work on, I don't think I ever want to work on anything again that like doesn't matter to other people. You know, I say a lot to graduate students and to other people who are interested in working in Native studies, like, it's awesome if it's interesting to you, but it has to matter to the people that you're writing about. And I think that that became very obvious to me as I was working on this project. Like, yes, this oral history project was interesting to me, but it also was interesting and a priority for the community that this history be written. And I think with anything that I write about in the future, I think that that is really an important value to me. I never want to write about something that's just because it's interesting to me. I want to make sure that whoever I'm writing about, especially as a non-Native historian, that I'm telling stories that are important to the communities that I'm working with, and that those histories are accurate, and that they're serving the priorities of those communities. So I think that's a really big value in writing for me. I think the other thing that I really learned through doing this project, and that is important to me, is that I really view writing as a collaborative process. I certainly don't hold enough knowledge to look at some of these older materials and to be able to reinterpret them in the way that they need to be reinterpreted as a non-Native person. I have to talk to other people. I have to, again, look outside of the archives for other places that knowledge is held. And so I think any writing project that I work on in the future, I will always view as collaborative and as something that I work on with other people.
That's great. So I have one final question. So if any of you have questions, there may be a couple of minutes to take those. What's next for you?
Well, this is a great segue because the project that I'm working on right now is actually incredibly collaborative. So for the last 4 years, the Newberry Library, along with a large group of community collaborators, has been working on a project called Indigenous Chicago, which will launch in September. So for those of you who are local, which I'm sure many of you are, I highly encourage you to keep an eye out for this in a few months. This is a multifaceted project that will include an exhibition at the Newberry, a website with more than half a dozen digital maps that reimagine the history of Chicago from an Indigenous perspective, curriculum that's written for 10th grade social studies, new oral histories with community members, and a series of public programs that will happen at the Newberry in the fall. And this project really started with community conversations and community members expressing interest in there being a central resource on the Indigenous past and present of Chicago. And so it started, we held a community meeting at the Newberry in January of 2020 where we asked people if this was of interest to people, and then we collectively created those 5 project components that I just rattled off, as well as drafted together 6 goals for the project that have really steered the project from the beginning. So that's really what I've been working on for the last 4 years is, co-curating the exhibition that will be opening, writing and reviewing a lot of the content. The project is being overseen by an advisory group of about 25 people that includes both Indigenous people who live in Chicago today, as well as representatives of tribes who were removed and have ancestral ties to Chicago. And so those various groups of people who have been shaping the project meet sometimes twice a month. And so it's been a lot of meetings and working with people to really co-create these materials. But the scholarly project that I'm sort of interested in exploring next grows out of this. And one of the things that I've realized as we've been working on the project, sort of interestingly, as we started working on the research for the project, I was the closest thing to an early American historian on the project leadership team, which I am not. But I actually have found it incredibly fascinating to have my head in materials from the late 17th century, and looking at these records. And what I realized from looking at them and from talking to people is that the story that we tell about the founding of Chicago is very wrong and inaccurate, and it largely erases Indigenous people and their role in the founding of the city. And so we're doing some of that work to push back against that narrative in the project, but I'm really interested in digging into that a little bit more through a scholarly project, and I really want to especially focus on the many Native women who sort of pop up in the archive from time to time, but I think will require a lot of looking in new places, reading a lot of their husbands' records, sort of against the grain, if you will, to sort of think about how they were very likely influencing their mostly non-Native husbands, but also working with community members. And so that I'm in this sort of stage right now of trying to figure out what a collaborative project like this would look like, and also talking to community members about, again, is this of interest to people? Is this something that people are interested in? The conversations that I've had thus far have been that, yes, this is something that community members are interested in. But it's still too early to say exactly what this will be. If it will be an article, if it will be a book project, if it will be a like an edited volume, if it will be something that I co-write with somebody, I'm not really sure yet. But what I can say is that I'm interested in getting into some of those early records and telling a new story about the founding of Chicago that kind of pushes back against the narrative that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that really centers people like Joliet and Marquette and DuSable and John Kinsey and people like that. So
interesting. I started out as an early Americanist, and now I'm very much in the contemporary, and you're going the other way.
Yeah.
Rose, how can people access this amazing project? That's one question. And I also just want to give a big plug for the Newberry. I hope that many of you in this room know about this incredible research library. But it is open to the public, and it is an amazing place you should visit. And you should also visit the website, right?
Yes, yes. So Indigenous Chicago will have a website, and I am so sorry I don't have the URL off the top of my head right now, but you will be able to Google Indigenous Chicago, and it will come up in the fall. It's not live yet, but it will also be linked from the Newberry's website. The exhibition opens on September 12th, so after September 12th, you'll be able to come to the library. It'll be open until, I believe, January 5th, so you'll have a few months there to see it. And a lot of the digital maps that we're creating are actually going to be on interactives within the exhibition, so you'll get to see both the items and some of the digital maps we've created. And then everything, after the exhibition closes, everything will continue to be available on the website. So we'll have some like virtual tours related to the exhibition, but there will also be all of the maps. The curriculum will be available on the website. There will be an archive of these oral histories that we've been doing, and recordings of the program. And the goal here is really to continue to add to the project website. We're not really envisioning it as something that we like launch and then never touch again. We really want it to be something that can continue to attend to tribal priorities, and that as things come up that community members realize they need support on, we can continue to add it to the website, and we can continue to connect people to the many people who are writing and researching about the Indigenous history of Chicago. So
that's terrific. I just got the sign from Carol. We've exhausted our time, right on time, I think. Just as a reminder, Rose will be upstairs on 9 with book signing, and if you have further questions, I promised you can ask them there. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Rose.
Thank you very much.